Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. In our moment, I'll pass you over to Peter. We're aiming for the discussion to last 30 minutes. If we do run over, the full version will be available on demand. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat box and we'll run through them at the end. I'll now pass you over to Peter.
Hello, I'm going to present to you this webinar on biosimilars and look at the opportunities and challenges for your business so that you yourselves can look and see if this is something that you want to be involved in yourselves. Let's begin with a very important question. What actually is a biosimilar? So a biosimilar is one on which there's now more or less general agreement. A biosimilar is a biological medicine highly similar to another already approved biological medicine. In other words, similar to the reference medicine. Now, it's important that we have this definition because there are other products which are biological products, and I will come to that later, which are not regulated in the same way. And the EMA specifically, the European Medicines Association, specifically emphasizes that developers of biosimilars have to demonstrate their similarity by comparability studies with the reference biological medicine. And what they particularly want to see is that it's similar in all sorts of physical and chemical characteristics in terms of its structure and its properties. And also, very importantly, that there are no clinically meaningful differences between the biosimilar and the reference medicine. Now, they do this by a process of clinical trials, and I'll deal with those in a little bit more detail later. But as you'll see from the footnote, by demonstrating biosimilarity, a biosimilar can rely on the safety and efficacy experience gained with the reference medicine. That means that the developer of the biosimilar does not have to replicate all the studies done by the originator. Its clinical efficacy is assumed. What the biosimilarity company has to do is prove that there is this similarity in terms of the structure and activity and efficacy and safety, and very importantly, immunogenicity profile. By that, it means that this product has no greater immunogenicity or production of immune effects than the original product has. Let's go on to the next slide. And the question which has to be asked, of course, is why the interest in biosimilars? And the interest in biosimilars is because the original copies that they reproduce are a very major force in the world pharmaceutical market. If you look at the chart, you'll see that I've outlined 5 products that were major products in 2016. There were also major products in 2017. But I wanted to emphasize what a significant proportion these are of the leading products in the pharmaceutical market. Now, it's interesting to note that 70% of this turnover in these biological products comes from the US and the Big 5 European markets. For those not familiar with the term, Big 5 means Germany, UK, France, Spain, and Italy. And IMS says that these account for more than 70% of the world turnover together with the US in biological products. And there are 2 possible reasons for this. One of these is, of course, that these are relatively high-priced markets, and so the turnover that there is in volume terms comes out as a very high value in value terms. And the other reason is, of course, that in many of the emerging and developing markets, such as the Asian markets and African markets, they just do not have the cash reserves to be able to pay these sorts of prices for the high-priced biological products. And therefore, we end up with a situation where the predominant part of the biological market is in the major Western European markets. This will no doubt change as prices fall, but in the meantime, that's where most of the sales are. But the interesting point here, particularly from the reference of biosimilars, is that these are very high-value products, and copying them makes a lot of economic sense, or at least becomes very attractive. Of course, biosimilars and generics are not the same thing. Generics are chemically defined copies of small molecule products. Biosimilars are copies of very complex biological products. And if you look at the screen in front of you, you can see on the left, we have the example of a small molecule. This is aspirin, and it has a mere 21 atoms in it. Look in the middle, and you see as we go up the scale of complexity, growth hormone. This is one of the first products that was registered as a biosimilar, and it has 3,000 atoms. In other words, even if it were just a simple chemical structure, it would be nearly 100 times as big as the aspirin. However, as you can see by looking at the picture, there's a lot of complexity there, and intertwining and cross-linking complexity of the molecule, which means that it's a lot more difficult to copy than a simple chemically synthesized medicine like aspirin. Let's go up one stage, and we see the antibody, which is a monoclonal antibody, and you can see that it is far, far more complex. And this is why producing biosimilars is such a difficult challenge, because the biosimilar has to be as close as possible to the structure of the original antibody as is possible. It will never be 100% identical. In fact, original company products are never 100% identical to the previous batch, because these are biological products. There is therefore a complexity in producing them reproducibly, which means that from time to time there will be slight variations. So the original is often a variant on itself, and similarly the biosimilar is a variant on it. Why aren't they the same as generics? Well, from the regulator's point of view, it would seem that these are the factors that they take into calculation. Proteins and biological products, as we've seen, are very much more complex than small molecules, and therefore demonstrating that they are indeed identical just is not possible. What is possible is to show similarity. And that's, as I said, because even the originator products differ from batch to batch very slightly from one another, and even they could not be shown to be identical to the product produced in a similar batch. The bioequivalence testing, which is used for small molecule generics, measures blood plasma levels. And as long as the bioequivalence of biosimilarity of one product is similar to that of the original product, then they are considered to be more or less identical to one another. Where we've got the issue of biosimilarity means that we don't have this simple course of measuring blood plasma levels. There are a lot of other tests that need to be gone through in order to prove the similarity between the two products. There's clinical effects and safety and efficacy studies. These are not normally required with small molecule generics. Bioequivalence or bioavailability of the product in the blood is considered a sufficient test to prove similarity or rather equivalence to the original product. Whilst with generics, it is possible to show that A absolutely is equal to B. With biologicals, as we've seen, it's a much more complex affair. Biologicals are generally not identically equivalent to B. A will not be identically equivalent to B, and so we have variations, but similarity is what is being called for. Why is the cost of entry high? Well, particularly because clinical studies are needed. Clinical studies are going to be complex, long-lasting, spread over a long period, and this is going to add to the costs. So the small molecule generics, copying is a relatively cheap process because it's generally involving a synthesis by somebody who has expertise in chemical production, and they can produce the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, at a relatively low price, which allows the generic company to use it to copy the originator product. Regulators then want to see information on the manufacturer, the quality of the materials, the proof of stability, compliance with what's called GMP, good manufacturing practice. And the only clinical work, as we said, is a bioequivalence study. The result of this is development costs fall to just a few £100,000 or euros. With biosimilars, as we've said, there's a large amount of analytical evidence that needs to be produced. This goes through a whole variety and batch of tests, which are far more complex and far more relevant than for the small molecule products. But the real cost issue comes with the clinical studies. For a start, the products that are used, the reference products, have to be bought, and some of them can have costs of several £100 or euros per dose. The clinical studies need hundreds of these doses to be administered over a long period in order to assess the efficacy of the biosimilars. And these costs together with the cost of the clinicians who have to do the work, the analytical work that's done then on the samples, pushes the development costs into the millions. And this is why the cost of entry is so high, and why companies have to ask themselves before they start getting into it, can I afford to be involved in biosimilars? There are benefits, of course, and there are risks involved in entering any market. But let's have a look at those that particularly relate to the biosimilars market. We've seen from the figures, the market for biological products is already huge. It's growing because there's an increased reliance on these products, which often achieve clinical results that are not available with small molecule products. Working with a development partner can lower the costs and ease the market entry. And of course, we've seen how big the market is. The potential rewards for the early market entrants can be high. In many of the emerging markets, despite the fact that there are low prices, there are large populations which have not previously been able to use these products and that will now have access to them. And this increase in the scale of use may compensate for the low prices. Now, the falling prices in some markets have led to rising prescription of biosimilars. We've seen this effect in Western European markets, where the original biological was considered too expensive to use widely. And naturally, of course, offsetting these benefits, there are a number of risks. Now, with the large number of competitors that are either in the market or planning to enter the market, competition levels are going to rise. We know the development costs are high because of the need for clinical studies. Where biosimilars are bought through tenders, and this is not the case in all markets, the biosimilar tenders, of course, can lead to prices dropping quite sharply. Entry into emerging markets is potentially difficult because protectionism, where the regulators and the local industry bodies try to protect the local industry against foreign competitors. With any biosimilar, of course, there is the possibility that the originator will take defensive measures to try and decrease the impact of the biosimilar by producing an improved version of Biobetter, or indeed developing a new biological NCE that treats the same indication but better. And only you and your company can assess whether the risks for you outweigh the benefits, or whether the benefits outweigh the risks. And therefore, the market is one that is worth entering for you. These terms, interchangeability, substitution, and switching, are often used mistakenly and interchangeably with one another. It's important to define them so that people can understand what they mean. Now, with the issue of interchangeability, it's one where the health or regulatory authority actually designates the body as interchangeable. They do that when they say that it's expected to produce the same clinical results as the reference product in any given patient. And they add to this the contingency that repeated switching between biosimilar and reference product should present no greater safety or efficacy risk than continuing the use of the reference product. Now, it's important to note in the context of the European Medicines Association Authority, EMA, that they have said they will not designate a product as interchangeable. They leave that to the national regulators and authorities to decide for themselves. However, the FDA, the US body, has said that it will issue, and has indeed issued, guidance on this, which it will then use to decide whether two products can be considered interchangeable. Substitution usually takes place at the pharmacist level. This is when a pharmacist decides for himself, or is required by regulations, to substitute a certain prescribed product by replacing it with an equivalent product. And this can be done with or without the prescribing physician's involvement, depending on the regulations in the relevant country. Finally, of course, you have the possibility of medical switching, where the decision is made by the treating physician. The physician himself says, I'm prepared to prescribe this biosimilar product in place of the original product, usually because he's persuaded that the efficacy is equivalent, the safety is equivalent, or he's under pressure to cut costs. Biosimilars market has been developing for the last decade. The first generation of biosimilars included products like EPO, which is erythropoietin, GCSF, granulocyte colony stimulating factor, also called filgrastim, and there's HGH, the human growth hormone. Now, the first companies to take advantage of the regulations were the generic companies. The EMA issued its first guidelines in 2006, and the generic companies spotted the opportunities very quickly. The US, by contrast, lagged a long way behind. It took until 2010 before it passed the relevant legislation. And on top of that, the FDA has taken several years to issue its biosimilar guidelines based on that legislation. But interestingly, there too, in the US market, it was the generic industry that first took advantage of the new guidelines and were the first to file applications for biosimilars. It's taken a long time for the big pharma companies to catch up because they decided to concentrate on the monoclonal antibodies, which are what might be called the second generation of biosimilars. And here, of course, the question arises, who will be able to most take a benefit and take advantage of the new market that's opening up, particularly in the US? Will it be the generic companies who are quick to react and can do so with respect to price a lot quicker? Or will it be the big pharma companies with their marketing ability who are able to persuade the prescribers and the insurers that their product is the one that should be used? Now, the early forecasts about what would happen in the market seem to have been slightly off target. 10 years ago, observers were predicting there would only be a handful of competition in the market for biosimilars. It was felt that the cost of development would be beyond the abilities of all but a few companies. And therefore, as a consequence of that, the limited levels of competition would limit the amount of price competition. But in fact, it turned out these predictions were wrong. What has happened is multiple companies have entered the market, either alone or in partnership with another company. In the partnerships, it generally works out that one company has the skills of manufacturing and the other partner has the commercial skills. And this has led to a number of interesting combinations. Not all companies have seen it this way. Some have felt that they can go it alone. And a prime example of that is the company Sandoz. It's the generic subsidiary of Novartis. And Sandoz has said that what it is going to do is distinguish itself from other generic companies by looking at difficult to manufacture products, and biosimilars certainly fall into that category. The second company that's working alone is one from the big pharma sector, which is Boehringer Ingelheim. Boehringer Ingelheim, as is probably well known, is a massive pharmaceutical company with massive resources, expertise in both marketing and the production of biological products. And so it felt comfortable going it alone. By contrast, we have a number of partnerships. And the outstanding one of these is the first company that really entered the monoclonal antibody biosimilars market, which is Celltrion. It formed alliances with Hospira and other companies, and it gave them the product, which they then used their marketing experience to market in the Western markets. Hospira had the rights for the product in a number of Western European markets and the US market. Hospira has now become a part of Pfizer, and this shows another company that's decided that biosimilars look like an interesting opportunity. A further example of a partnership is that between Mylan, the US-based generics company, and the Indian Biocon that has a lot of skills in the production of biological products and is doing the biological development and manufacture for its partner, Mylan. And the result of this is that more companies are entering the market than was originally predicted, and this has led to competition and falling prices as has happened with so many generic products, particularly where the biosimilars are being brought through tenders. We've got a lovely example of the effect of tenders in Scandinavia, and this was the Norwegian authorities who have run an aggressive program of tendering for biosimilars, and particularly the monoclonal antibody biosimilars. Now, Steinar Madsen of the Norwegian Medicines Agency produced this slide, which shows very, very effectively how the introduction of tendering has led to a dramatic fall in prices. In the first tender year, the originator did not cut their price, but the biosimilar products did, and they led to a 39% discount on the originator. And this, as I would remind you, is in complete contrast to the original predictions that there would be a small and gradual decline in prices of the biosimilar products because of the limited competition. By the second year, the level of competition had risen, and the discount against the originator now was 69%. This is a massive discount, and it's shown how once multiple products enter the market and products or biosimilar products are included in tenders for biological products, it can be a dramatic fall in price and enormous savings for the healthcare authorities in that particular country. And other countries have not been blind to this. They've seen the Norwegian example and therefore included biosimilars in their tenders. What's happening in other parts of the world, because Europe and the US are not everything? We're concentrated on the West, and we've seen that many other countries have now introduced regulatory procedures for follow-on biological products. And what they have done in many cases is copied elements of the EMA's guidelines. Sensibly, these countries have decided there's no point reinventing the wheel. The wheel already exists, so we'll just adapt it slightly to our particular circumstances. Not all, though, have done that to the same extent and with the same degree of stringency. Some of these products, which have been registered under the less stringent system, may be called biocopies rather than biosimilars. And there are two arguments concerning these. One, that there is an upside. In other words, that more patients in poorer countries are receiving biological products and treatments that were previously unaffordable. Offsetting this, of course, is the counter argument. There is possibly a downside that the quality of the products might be lower, and this could be leading to a higher level of side effects. Now, it's noticeable that those countries where they've introduced these do not necessarily always have very effective or rigid pharmacovigilance procedures. And it's quite possible that the sensitivity of the pharmacovigilance procedures that do exist in those countries is not high enough to be able to detect these side effects. The debate continues, and we'll no doubt see more about it as the years go by, as to whether there is not enough sensitivity in the pharmacovigilance, or that there are not enough side effects for it to be a real issue. There is, though, in respect of biosimilars in other parts of the world, a growing ability of Indian and Chinese companies to manufacture these products, or the active ingredients for them, to a standard that satisfies Western regulators such as the EMA and FDA. And it's quite possible that as time goes on, we'll see most of the manufacture of biosimilars move to low-cost centers in Asia. Probably the company that started this trend was Celltrion with its infliximab biosimilar that I mentioned before, that it licensed out then to Hospira and other companies in the West. And that completes our webinar. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Peter. We've got a question here. Do you think that generic companies will be able to dominate the US biosimilar market in the same way that they have done in Europe?
All right, this is an interesting question, and in my opinion, it depends on a combination of two major factors. There are possibly more, but the two major factors that I have identified are, firstly, price. The question is, will insurers place their emphasis on low cost and thereby give an advantage to companies with low cost production, such as the generic companies, over those with marketing ability, such as the big pharma companies. The second point, I think, is that it will depend on who actually makes the decision. If it's left to prescribers, I believe that they may prefer the originator product that they already know, or a biosimilar for one of the big pharma companies such as Boehringer Ingelheim that I mentioned, who have the ability to market well. If alternatively it's left to the insurers themselves to decide, they may just instruct prescribers to go for the lower cost version, and that may well be all that they're prepared to reimburse, irrespective of who's offering it.
Great, thank you. And second question coming through. Have biosimilars made any difference to treatment patterns?
Oh, I think that there has to be an absolutely definite yes in reply to this, because what it has done has increased the availability of biological products for people who did not have access to them previously. Prescribers who wanted to use a biological product for treatment in the past have often used them only to a limited extent due to the higher costs and the restrictions on their prescribing budgets. Now that biosimilars have brought down treatment costs, there is evidence to show from market data that doctors have increased the amount of them that they are prescribing. They're prescribing these biological products and biosimilars on a much greater scale, and thereby expanded the patient population that has access to these treatments. So I think that's a win-win situation.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions that we have time for now, but please do continue to send your questions through and we will answer them separately. As I said earlier, we'll be sending around the slides and the recording in a couple of days for you to listen on demand. You can read more about the programs that PTI offer at pti-global.co.uk. See you next time. Thank you.